Now I had this crazy idea to create a video to debunk the 3-2-1 method for cooking ribs. In this video, I followed the 3-2-1 method perfectly. I expected it to fail, but to my surprise, one of these racks turned out fantastic. Now, for those that aren't familiar with the 3-2-1 method, it requires you to smoke your ribs for 3 hours, wrap with foil, and cook for additional 2 hours. And lastly, unwrap, place back on the cooker, and cook it for an additional hour. I think the simplicity of this technique makes it so appealing, especially for beginners. Now, as you can guess, I changed the direction for this video, and instead of debunking the 3-2-1 method, this will be a guide for beginners on cooking ribs on the Weber Smokey Mountain. And at the end, I'm going to discuss the pitfalls to using the 3-2-1 method. You know, things to watch out for and how to make it work. Let's get started. I'm going to be using the Weber Smokey Mountain 22-inch for this cook, but don't worry if you have a different smoker. Many of these tips are transferable. For smaller cooks like ribs, partition out your charcoal ring. Place in the 2 Weber baskets. You could also use fire bricks, and then add your charcoal. Light up a small Weber chimney. Now, if you're using a large chimney, do half a large chimney. Let's add the lit charcoal up on top. With time, this lit charcoal will slowly ignite the rest, keeping you at a nice, low and slow temperature. This is known as the minion method. Next, add your favorite wood chunks. Place in your midsection. Add your water bowl lined with foil, and then add in some hot water. You can fill it all the way, but I don't find it necessary. For a short cook, lining the bowl with foil is not required, but it will make cleanup a lot easier. Our target temperature for today is 225 degrees Fahrenheit. I personally like cooking hotter than 225, but since we're doing the 3-2-1 method, I'll stick to 225. From experience, if I go higher than 225 with this method, the ribs will just end up overcooking. Let's prep our ribs. These are St. Louis cut style ribs. Essentially, these are spare ribs that have been squared off and the tips removed. Now you can buy these pre-cut, but if you wish to learn how to trim spares into a St. Louis style rib, let me know in the comments and that could be a future video. Now if I do make it, I'll be sure to link it up here and down in the description. If we flip these ribs over, you'll see the membrane on the back of the ribs. Now to remove the membrane, many will suggest use a butter knife. You'll get under the skin and then use your fingers to get in there and then remove. Most of the time it'll come off in one piece, but when it fails, it'll usually be when you're demonstrating on camera like I have. I personally don't use a knife. I'll use paper towels to get right underneath. Then just rip it clean. Both of these techniques aren't always successful. Sometimes it just won't come off in one piece, but that's okay. Now that the membrane is off, let's apply our rub. But before we do that, I'm gonna apply a mustard binder. Personally, I'm not a fan of the mustard binder, but the majority of people recommend it, so I'm gonna do it here. The number one reason people use it is to get the rub to stick. Most meats you get, like these ribs, will have plenty of moisture for the rub to stick. As you can see here, the rib doesn't fall off this other rack. Now otherwise, if the meat doesn't have enough moisture, just go ahead and spray with just a little bit of water and you'll be okay and the rub will stick fine. But to keep these 2 racks of ribs consistent, I'm also going to apply some mustard on the second rack. Now the other reason people use a mustard binder is for better bark. However, I had ribs with plenty of great bark without using any mustard. And although it is very true that the mustard flavor just won't be noticeable all the way by the time they're finished cooking, why use it at all? If it's not for flavor, bark, or to get the rub to stick, what is the purpose? To be honest, the only binder I'm a big fan of is using hot sauce. It's the only binder that I use that I can actually taste after it's cooked. It gets a very subtle heat, so I'd highly recommend you do that. And next, let's apply our rub. Any good barbecue rub will work here. I'm using PS Seasoning Honey Chipotle. Let's place our racks on the grill for the first part of the cook. This involves smoking the ribs for 3 hours. I'll start my timer. Now it's important to monitor your smoker's temperature and make sure it stays close to 225. Now a few degrees on either side won't hurt. We aren't cooking with an oven, so the temperature won't be as precise. And you know what? That's completely okay. Now, how do you make the 3-2-1 method work? Use it as a guideline, not as a strict set of rules. For each step, use a number as a suggestion. For example, you might not need to smoke your ribs for 3 hours. If the rub sets at 2.5 hours, wrap it then. If it takes 3.5 hours, then that's how long it takes. Now, what do I mean by letting your rub set? Simply use your finger and touch your ribs. If your rub comes off with your fingers, then the rub hasn't set and it's not ready to wrap. In fact, if you are cooking hotter, your rub is going to set faster. Now, once we get close to the 3-hour mark, I've decided to get my wrap ready. I've had success adding nothing to the wrap. But you know what? Since it's common advice to go with the butter honey treatment, then that's exactly what I'm going to be doing to this wrap today. I'll drop in some butter, honey, brown sugar, and more of that barbecue rub I used earlier. Once the ribs hit 3 hours of smoking, I'll remove them and place them meat side down. I'll do the same to the top of the ribs. Add butter, honey, brown sugar, and more of that rub. Next, let's wrap them tight. Make sure there are no air pockets. Air pockets will result in steaming the ribs, so try to avoid that. Now, is the wrap necessary? Absolutely not. I've had great luck going unwrapped the entire time, but it's really a matter of preference. Wrapping definitely makes the cook go faster, and it's part of the process for the 3-2-1 method, so I went ahead and did it. The second rack is going with the same butter, honey, sugar rub treatment. Again, make sure they're wrapped nice and tight and placed back on the cooker. Now that the ribs have been wrapped for 2 hours, let's remove and unwrap. You're looking for a good pullback when checking in on the wrapped ribs. The ribs shouldn't fall off, but they should be more exposed. There isn't enough bend or enough bone pullback. Keep them wrapped and check back on them in 30 minutes. As you can see, there's a really nice bone pull, but the bone is not sliding off. These aren't completely tender yet, but they will be in the final part of the cook. In this part, we'll need to remove from the foil wrap and put back on the grill and cook for another hour. Some people like to sauce at this point. I personally like to sauce in the last 15 minutes of the cook. For these 2 racks, however, I will not be saucing. I really want to taste the rub. The sauce can be a little overwhelming at times. Once you reach that 1 hour mark, let's remove and let the ribs rest a bit before slicing. Now, the last final part is perhaps the most critical, since you're removing the ribs once you determine that they're perfectly tender. The first rack has a nice bend to the ribs. These are perfectly tender in my opinion. The second rack doesn't have a good bend. Normally, I'd place these back on the grill for another 30 minutes or so for them to finish cooking. But this is the 3-2-1 method and not the 3-2-1.5 method, so I'm going to call them done. Now, besides the bend test, I also like to probe it. I usually do it with a skewer or a toothpick, or even a temperature probe. It should slide right in with very little resistance. When you go to remove it, it should slide right out and not move your ribs too much. Let me slice the first rack. Turn them over so you can see the bone and slice away. I'm going to take a quick bite. As you can see, there's a very clean bite and the rest of the meat is still adhered to the bone. This is how I like my ribs. Bite off the bone, not fall off the bone. As you can see, they are plenty tender but have a bit of a bite. Ultimately, once eaten, there won't be any meat stuck to any of the bones, and this is exactly what you want. Next, let's slice through the second rack. Now, these racks seem to be a little more drier and not as tender. These ribs needed just a bit more time for the fat to completely render. But I knew that when I picked up the ribs. But I restrained myself and kept the 3-2-1 timing to prove a point. Now, before I share how to make the 3-2-1 method work, I'll explain why you shouldn't follow it exactly like I did in this video. The reason is very simple. The 3-to-1 method is not the ideal method because it isn't accurate and is not consistent. It relies on timing and not the look and feel of the rib. The reason timing doesn't work is because there are many factors to consider. Factors like the thickness of the ribs, the temperature of your smoker, and the rub you're using, whether or not you use a water pan, and how much food you're actually putting in the cooker can all mess up with the timing of the 3-to-1 method. So it'll be important to make necessary adjustments. Now, any pitmaster will tell you that in order to cook delicious, perfectly tender ribs, you don't rely on the clock or your temperature probe. Knowing when ribs are done is determined by how tender they are and not the internal temperature or the specific amount of time that they've been on the grill. So what's the bottom line? Well, with the right adjustments to the 3-to-1 method, you'll be producing some great ribs each and every time. Remember, use those timings as a rough guideline, but it's really up to you to make the necessary timing adjustments to make sure you aren't over or undercooking them. Thanks for watching.